Good afternoon. We're bringing you updates on the situation in Ukraine on ST Live. Thanks for joining us. U.S. President Joe Biden has delivered his first State of the Union speech that concluded a short while ago, where he addressed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In it, he had some strong words for his Russian counterpart, President Vladimir Putin.
Putin's latest attack on Ukraine was premeditated and totally unprovoked. He rejected repeated efforts at diplomacy. He thought the West and NATO wouldn't respond. He thought he could divide us at home, in this chamber, in this nation. He thought he could divide us in Europe as well. But Putin was wrong. We are ready. We are united, and that's what we did. We stayed united.
Mr. Biden also spoke about the economic cost of the war in Ukraine and said the U.S. and its allies will tap on its oil reserves to combat inflation and rising prices around the world.
Tonight, I can announce the United States has worked with 30 other countries to release 60 million barrels of oil from reserves around the world. America will lead that effort, releasing 30 million barrels of our own strategic petroleum reserve. And we stand ready to do more if necessary, united with our allies.
Almost 1 week into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Russian forces are intensifying their assaults on main cities. Overnight strikes have resulted in deaths and damage. 2 Russian missiles struck a TV tower in the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, knocking out some access to news and broadcasts. The Ukrainian emergency services said 5 people were killed. Ukraine's defense minister said the Kremlin aimed to cut off a large part of Ukraine from the internet and communications. The Russian military campaign appears to have shifted toward targeting civilian areas with increasingly powerful weapons. Russia warned Kiev residents to flee their homes and rained rockets on Ukraine's second biggest city of Kharkiv. And let's get some perspectives from a military analyst. Dr. Samir Puri from the International Institute for Strategic Studies joins us now. Dr. Samir, good to have you with us. Russia's invasion of Ukraine seems to be entering a new phase. Since yesterday, we've been seeing images of a huge 64-kilometer convoy making its way to Kiev. Now, to the untrained eye, these look like sitting ducks waiting to be attacked. But from a military stand, what can you tell us about the significance of this massive convoy?
Well, it looks very much like something very worrying for the residents of Kiev is awaiting them on the northern motorway, which leads up to Belarus. Russian forces reached Kiev last week on Friday, just a couple of days after the invasion began. But these appear to have been quite light Russian formations. Perhaps they're mounting probing attacks. They reached northern residential districts of Kiev. There are no armoured vehicles. There's no sizable Russian military presence in Kiev right now. But this convoy appears to be precisely this, an invasion force that may either directly enter Kiev or perhaps it might contribute to an encirclement of the capital city, because there are also Russian forces approaching from other directions. And the final observation on this, Lynn, is that there is no airstrike that the Ukrainian Air Force appears to be able to mount against this convoy. Perhaps they look like sitting ducks, but it would appear that Russia has more air superiority now than it did in the opening days of the campaign.
Now, talking about air superiority, we're also seeing heavier bombardment of the cities in Ukraine. What do you think is Putin's military aim, and what would be a win for the Russian forces?
Well, no one entirely knows, because ultimately Russia has undertaken a really ambitious military campaign, which is to decapitate the Ukrainian government and to defeat the Ukrainian military. I'd say that the bombardment of the cities is more a signal of what will come if the Russian military moves in to take these key cities, many of which it hasn't taken. It's encircling them. But what does Russia's military want to achieve? I think in this instance, it would be to defeat Ukraine's military in a very particular way. And I'd also draw a viewer's attention to something we're not really talking about, which is the eastern part of Ukraine. There was a war going on there, a low-intensity war since 2014. There's a sizable Ukrainian military presence in the east of Ukraine. It could potentially be cut off if Russia's advances from the south, from Crimea, and from the north through Kharkiv actually are able to cut off that Ukrainian military presence in the east of the country.
Now, let's take it back a little bit. Putin has said he will deal with any NATO countries that get involved in a military way. One has to ask if Russia, at this point, is really capable of waging a full-scale Cold War-style war with Europe.
Well, the Cold War didn't involve a war involving Russia. It involved conflicts in places like Vietnam and Afghanistan. But during the Cold War, there was no direct confrontation between the Warsaw Pact, Russia, and NATO. Russia is already in a state of Cold War with the West, arguably. It's been under sanctions, lighter sanctions, since it annexed Crimea in 2014. But it appears that Putin and his inner circle have priced in and accept a total isolation from the Western-run parts of the global economy. It seems that they will accept things like companies like Apple banning their products in Russia, things like Russian airlines not being able to fly into Western countries. It appears that Putin wants to pay and is capable of absorbing a very high cost for what he sees as an existential crisis, which is Ukraine's drift westward into wanting NATO and EU membership.
Thank you very much for your insights. Dr. Samir Puri from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Now, meanwhile, Ukrainian Foreign Minister has called on his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi in a phone call asking for help from Beijing in mediating a ceasefire with Russia. For more, Danson Cheong from Straits Times China Bureau joins us. Danson, Kuleba said Ukraine is willing to strengthen communications with China and looks forward to China playing a role in realizing a ceasefire. What is the Chinese reaction to this?
Well, Lynn, it's so far been positive. I think the general sense here in China is that the war is going to destabilize the situation in Europe and the world, and it's not going to be in China's interest, especially in a year where the Communist Party is going to hold its very important party congress. So I think this, but I think it's also worth noting that this suggestion, for China to play a role as a mediator, was put forward by the Ukrainian foreign minister and not China, and as far as I know, the Russians have not made the same request of China. But I think the fact that China chose to highlight this, in its statement of the call between the two foreign ministers, I think is significant, and I think it shows China's openness to something like this. I think going forward, the question is, if this really does happen, what sort of role, does this look like? How can China play, such a mediating role?
So, Danson, why do you think China is trying to do this now?
Well, I think let's look at it this way. I think since the conflict started last week, China has been calibrating its position on the war. At the start, it was blaming NATO and the US, for starting the conflict. It says, it understands Russian security concerns. At the same time, it says, national sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected, although it doesn't specifically mention Ukraine. So, many people have, pointed out that China is trying to balance what they call competing objectives. On the one hand, its strategic partnership with Russia is important, because of growing competition with the West. At the same time, China needs to maintain its connections to the rest of the world. It needs to ensure, that it can continue to do business and doesn't, ruin its relations with Europe and the US. But it's come under fire for this contradictory position. The Chinese say the situation is complex, so their position is also necessarily complex. But outside of China, Beijing has taken quite a reputational hit for its position. So I think this phone call between Wang Yi and his Ukrainian counterpart is the first high-level contact between China and Ukraine since the invasion started last week. So I think that's significant. I think it's a sign of China further calibrating its position. And I don't think that the Russians will be very happy about that. But at the same time, I think China also sees an opportunity here. And to answer your question, there was this Chinese scholar who wrote recently that great powers, not because of their ability to wage wars or change the status quo, but because of their ability to keep the peace.
All right, it'll be interesting to see if China can resolve this crisis in one way or another. Thank you very much, Danson Chong, our China correspondent. The UN Refugee Agency says the situation in Ukraine could become Europe's largest refugee crisis this century. More than 600,000 refugees believed to have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries so far. Most have moved to Poland, Hungary, Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, while others have made their way towards various other European countries. The UN agency says there has been much solidarity and hospitality from the countries receiving refugees, including from the authorities and local communities. Joining thousands of refugees fleeing to Poland on foot is Hollywood actor Sean Penn. He was in the Ukrainian capital to film scenes for his documentary on Russia's invasion. In a Twitter post, he said he had to abandon his car near the Polish border and walk several miles into Poland. And as always, you can follow the latest updates and reactions on the Ukraine crisis at straitstimes.com. And remember to hit subscribe to stay informed. Do activate the bell icon on YouTube and you will be notified the next time we go live. I'm Lin Li Fu. Thanks very much for watching.